Um, and we're restarting from this after the summer break. The idea is we have a theme and a paper that we base our discussion around each month. And I'm very pleased that Moran agreed to have us both to speak and for us to use her paper as the starting point for this series of sessions and today. So Marie is an assistant professor in equality studies at UCD, where she's also the director of the Equality Studies Research Centre and the author of Identity and Capitalism in 2015, and currently working on 2 further books, Inequality in the 21st Century and Elites in Populist Times. And she's talking today about her paper, Keywords as Method, which engages with the work of Raymond Williams and the idea of cultural materialism. So I think we'll perhaps go straight over to Marie, and then she'll be followed by Owen, Owen Worth, who is going to act as discussant. Okay, thanks, Marie.
Thanks so much, David. I feel like I've gone rogue because for one of the first times I'm not using slides, but I think the invitation was really just to talk generally to the paper for 10 or 15 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And I'm very grateful for the invitation because I'm a big fan of the collective CPERN brain. So I'll give a brief overview of the paper and why I wrote it, and I'll supplement it with some examples from my other work, which I didn't have too much space to go into in the paper itself. So this is one of those papers I've wanted to write for a long time, but I only recently got around to it. It always seemed somehow less urgent than other things I had to write. And yet I could never completely get rid of the niggle that was behind the paper, which was that people seemed to be widely impressed by Williams's keywords approach and seemed to grasp theoretically the relationship between language change and social change that it describes, but they never seem to fully put it into practice in their keywords analysis. There are so many books self-consciously in the keywords genre or mode, and many of them are great. But the problem from my perspective is that they tend to emulate the format, but not entirely the spirit of Williams's original. So the words they identify are certainly key in the sense Williams intended. So as I say in the article, they are words whose evolving meanings seem to capture, express, and legitimize the politics and sensibility of their socio-historic context. But the analysis then tends to lapse into discussions of the academic histories or debates over the meaning of the word, and or to only cursorily trace the real world meaning changes of the word in relation to the real material contexts of its use. Part of the problem here may be that Williams elaborated much more fully on the relationship of meaning change to social change in his other work. And though the introduction to keywords is incredibly rich in this regard, it's also quite understated. And to my mind, a much fuller expression of his understanding of this relationship is worked out in Marxism and Literature, which, if you can see, this is one of those really pleasing, books I like, really kind of older books with very plain subsection titles like Determination, Productive Forces. There's no kind of fancy semicolons, just get straight to the point. But when you read these 2 books together, when you read keywords together with Marxism and Literature, it becomes much harder to stand over, never mind produce, a keywords type book or essay that's really just an annotated glossary of terms. So in some ways, however, my development of Williams's approach does actually go beyond the original, in that I see in his combined works the possibility of using the keywords approach as part of a bigger historicist and materialist study of the relationship between linguistic and social change. So rather than list a whole series of words that are somehow bound up with the experience and legitimation of a particular socio-historic context, it has seemed to me useful to focus in a much more in-depth way on a single word, or perhaps a related cluster of words that are particularly loaded, troublesome, burdened with conflicting meanings, yet which at the same time, as is also crucial to the Keywords project, present as self-evident, axiomatic, unexceptional, referring to something that just unproblematically exists. And this tension should be evident in everyday as well as rarefied academic uses of the word. So one such word is identity, which I wrote about in my book, Identity and Capitalism. And at the time, and there was and still is an enormous and divided academic literature on whether we should understand our identities as constructed or naturally occurring, as essential or fluid and contingent, as rooted in biology or politics or culture. There was also the widely shared sense, indeed, I'd say a conviction, that we all have an identity, that people have always had identities, and that whether constructed or natural, they've always been crucial to how we understand ourselves and form relationships with others. But what my keywords analysis showed in this respect was, in fact, that identity, particularly as it is elaborated in the associated categories of personal and social identity, is a relatively new concept in Western thought, politics, and culture. And a very extensive trawl of books, articles, magazines, journals, ads, manifestos, basically anything I could get my hands on, including of texts now routinely supposed to be about identity, revealed that until the 50s or 60s, there was no discussion of sexual identity, ethnic identity, political identity, national identity, consumer identity, corporate identity, brand identity, losing identity, finding identity, identity crisis. No discussion at all of identity in any of the ways that are so familiar to us today and which we would now find so hard to do without. Where the term was used, it referred to the sameness of an entity to itself, as in oneness, or the exact sameness of two separate entities, as in the phrase an identity of interests, or like the adjective identical twins. It was also used in metaphysical philosophy, in puzzles over the persistence and sameness of an entity, whether human or inanimate, so whether a person or a tree, over time. And what the keywords as method analysis showed was that what had happened in the explosion of use of the word in the second half of the 20th century was not just a meaning change and popularization of an older word, but the emergence of a new way of framing and thinking about selfhood and otherness. In this way of thinking, the category of identity draws on those older suppressed meanings of sameness to offer a particular essentializing way of construing personhood and grouphood, thereby functioning as a modern classificatory device to categorize people or groups as of a particular kind. And this finding thus illustrates Williams's claim that keywords are words whose problems of meaning are inextricably bound up with the problems they're used to discuss. But these changing meanings of a word, masked, as Williams said, by a nominal continuity over time, they're only part of the picture. The other part is how that meaning change is related to the material contexts of its emergence and expression. And this is firstly in terms of how changing material and social conditions and needs provide particular motivations and pressures for the development of a language to express the new social relations they were generating. But the relationship also works the other way. The development of a new language or set of meanings and ideas has causal effect and enables people to understand and act in a particular way in the new context, making certain actions seem sensible, normal, desirable, right, and so on. This is what I also explain in the paper in the more theoretical terms of the paradigm of cultural materialism. The essence of this approach is materialist in its insistence that we must analyze ideas, values, and cultural forms in the social and economic conditions of their production and circulation, by which they're also inevitably shaped. So far, so Marxist, and you'll all be familiar with that kind of claim. But what makes it cultural materialism is Williams's emphasis on the causal power of these words and ideas, the productive power of language. Williams argues that the central notion of historical materialism, that man makes his own history, had been up to now interpreted purely in terms of the capacity to labor, when for Williams, an equally constitutive activity in making one's own history is our practical consciousness. Developing key aspects of Marxist thought, Williams argues that consciousness must be seen from the beginning as part of the human material social process and its products in ideas as much part of this process as the material products themselves. This means that language and meaning change is not just the expression of a changing material context and set of needs, but an attempt to frame, shape, and act on that context. This is why Williams critiqued Marxist conceptions of culture for exhibiting not so much an excess, but a deficit of materialism. Unlike within received Marxism, culture, ideas, meaning, and language are not part of some ideal space operating over our heads or reflective of the real action going on elsewhere, but instead are themselves material. As Williams put it, they are built into our living. Keywords method then is not just about tracing the changing meanings of a word over time, or bringing to light suppressed or submerged meanings, but rather tracing these evolving and conflictual meanings in the context of their use. You have to find out not just what the meaning change is, but when that meaning change happened. And as I say in the paper, it means asking what else was going on where this change of meaning started to manifest and then consolidate. Why did a keyword emerge when it did? And what has this to do with the changing shape of capitalist, but also racist and gendered societies in which it came to prominence? And what new practices and experiences are being enabled and shaped by this emergent and novel use of language? So Williams advocated a documentary method, not as a simple means of gathering data, but rather as the best means of capturing what he called a structure of feeling, which he defined as the felt sense of the quality of life at a particular time and place, a sense of the ways in which the particular activities combined into a way of thinking and living. And I think this is again best illustrated with an example, which I'll also draw from Identity and Capitalism. And here I looked specifically at the context of use for the new senses of personal and social identity, which I was tracing. And what I found is that references to and uses of personal identity to refer to individuality or a distinctive sense of self with special or unique characteristics, these first emerged in contexts of consumption from the 1950s onwards, particularly where these emphasized lifestyle and distinction, and where they were underwritten by new popular psychological discourses of personal transformation and stability. The new idea of personal identity offered a useful way of asserting both similarity with and difference from others via practices of emulation and distinction in the so-called mass society. Significantly, once people are persuaded that they have an identity in the first place, in part by its very invention, they are motivated to try to find it. In the consumer society, the psychological problem of finding an identity finds a ready solution in engagement in practices of consumption, which allows for the visible marking of that identity, thereby finding and marking it at the same time. So analysis of texts and various social and cultural practices from this period reveals that the idea of personal identity, as we now know it, did not pre-exist, but emerged alongside and as part of these practices of consumption, which have now come to characterize 20th century capitalism. And I did a similar kind of work on the notion of social identity and our tendency to refer to key social characteristics and divisions as identities. That's also a very recent development, and trace the emergence of both to the new social movements around race and gender in the 60s and 70s. But to conclude, as I conclude in the article, methodologically complex and complicated words such as identity, but also choice, environment, the people, I'm sure you could think of a huge number yourselves. These words are not barriers to social scientific analysis, as is often assumed to be the case, but rather properly mined within a cultural materialist paradigm, offer a unique insight into the social changes with which the new and sometimes conflicting uses of the word are bound up. In this respect, a keyword functions as a key to a cipher and promises to unlock a wealth of sociological information on culturally mediated and inflected social change. Within a cultural materialist paradigm that insists we should not, in an idealist fashion, understand concepts only in relation to other concepts, but rather crucially in relation to the material and practical world of their use. So that's me. Finished? I can't see you.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks so much for setting out the paper, and it's also very thought-provoking the way you present and give some illustrations and examples as well. So thanks, Anon. I'm going to be interested to hear what Owen has to say as well. And I should introduce him as well because he deserves an introduction. So Owen Worth is based at the University of Limerick, where he also currently is head of department of the Department of Politics and Public Administration. And in terms of his publications, his most recent book is Morbid Symptoms, The Global Rise of the Far Right, which we've actually discussed on one of our earlier workshops. And before that, in 2015, a book called Rethinking Hegemony. So there's definitely overlaps between his work and your discussion. So it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. And also, before I finish, he's also on the executive board of the Critical Political Economy Research Network. So thanks, Owen.
Hi, yeah. Thanks a lot to that, Marie. I'm going to just, I'm not going to go on very long, but there's a few things I'd just like to add to that. And some of this is a reflection of what you've said, and there's nothing, a huge amount I can really criticize, because I like your work, and I think it's very important. And so a lot of this is going to be around why it's important, I think. And you know, what we can take from cultural materialism more generally, and you're placing Raymond Williams alongside a wider collective of cultural studies theorists, and what they can add, and I think what is often missing from some CPE material, and it's something that I've worked on personally for a long time in the areas of hegemony. So firstly, just to talk, I think you described your approach and the way you express or the way you understand, the way you utilize the keywords method very well, and I think you give a good background of identity, and I think you probably haven't talked as much as you might do about some of your more recent work on elites, which fit into this really well. You know, the construction of like new forms of populism around elites, and again how this, you know, can come back really nicely, if you like, to Williams's work. So just to say, Raymond Williams as an individual was, and I don't know how much other people know about him, but he was a sort of Welsh language exponent initially, but he was very much part of the New Left tradition, and he worked quite closely later on with individuals like Stuart Hall, people like Hoggart, and Richard Johnson, which would set up the Birmingham Cultural Studies unit. Well, I think across the road from where David is now, but doesn't exist anymore, obviously. So I was quite lucky in one sense. I come from very much this background, because where I did my PhD was basically the place where they later moved to in Nottingham, people like Richard Johnson anyway. And so a lot of us were very much who worked there. Phoebe is another person at that time, Phoebe Moore, were very much integrated and engaged upon with the sort of cultural materialism. And that's how we entered, I suppose, or two of us anyway, entered political economy. And it's very much different from some of the more top-down, our approaches, shall we say, our way in to Marx, and as a result, Gramsci, I suppose, is entirely different from the way in that most would come into this in a critical political economy. And I think this is quite important, because culture's talked about obviously in critical political economy, but it is generally referred to or placed in the same sort of manner as Bob Jessup sort of his approach to culture, which is very much within his larger sort of structural functionalist framework, which owes a lot to Palancis and that approach to Gramsci. And you know, that's one way of approaching things, but through Raymond Williams and also Hall and Hoggart and Johnson, you come to this in a different light. And Jim Martin, in his recent book, which isn't out yet, so I sort of well, I refereed it, so I have the insight. So it's coming out at the beginning of next year. Puts this very well in his approach to it's called hegemony. Key concepts in hegemony. It's a very actually an introductory book by Polity, but he describes this very well. He sort of separates the ideological approach, or the approach which I'd say ideology, but it comes from the sort of Marxism of guarantees of Hall, or the cultural materialism of Williams, the sort of foundational approach which takes culture as eutherism and then places this within the wider dynamics of production, and in this way approaches things through a sort of ideological framework, as opposed to the sort of state, the state theory approach, which does things in a neat way, but slightly differently. And so this is why I think it's very important for the study of critical political economy, because it sort of approaches things from almost bottom up rather than top down. And Marxism without guarantees and cultural materialism, the two sort of buzzwords from Hall and Williams, provides a different way in than the sort of putting culture in its place or putting civil society in its place from the sort of Jessup methods. And they're very complementary, but they look at things and they approach things in a different angle, which all sort of applies and should really extend the sort of ontological traditions of critical political economy well. So as is, I think, the real sort of plus point of this, and I find certainly Marie's work very. It's great that this material, which has always been around in cultural studies and utilised through different subjects, some of which stray off into the sort of post-structuralist dynamic, or the sort of far more towards the sort of Dederian at times dynamic. Others very much located within this Raymond Williams tradition, as Marie has demonstrated. And the special issue, just out of interest, which is this part of is an excellent special issue as well. But I think that I'm delighted that we're moving far more into looking at these studies, because it is something that I think certainly in CPERN we need more of. I'm going to leave it there because I've talked too long.
Great, thank you. That's a nice way of putting the paper also in a kind of contextual position, in how we can think about different traditions within critical political economy as well. So thanks. Do you want to respond at all, Marie?
I'll respond very briefly, because I think people probably who have things to say might want to come out and say them instead of listening for much more. But just to say thanks very much, Owen. I really appreciate you reading and engaging with my work and your kind appraisal of it. I think you're right to raise, and I'm very interested in the question of what is the relationship between cultural materialism or cultural Marxism, the Marxist side of cultural studies, and then also critical political economy, which this kind of network is focused on. And I think Bob Jessup, who you referred to, I think he talks about cultural political economy as a broad church, and he says that a lot. And I think he means it in a generous sense, that there's certain family characteristics, but there's differences. And I think one of the big shared characteristics between cultural materialism and critical political economy is a refusal to reduce the cultural, the ideational meanings, etc., to an epiphenomenon of the real activity going on in the economic sphere or base. But it does this in a way that I think is really helpful, and a very helpful counter to the post-structuralist turn, which is relentlessly idealist. And I think where cultural materialism and critical political economy, where their strength lies in their bringing back in of questions of culture, is insisting on seeing them as material and looking at ideas not in relationship to other ideas or concepts in relation to the concepts, but in relation to the real world in which they have an effect. So that's sort of where I start when I look at the connections. But I also think you're right, Owen, to raise that there's the point that there's clear divergences there. And I think you mentioned the state kind of questions of political power in the state is sometimes very absent from cultural studies, or no, not cultural studies so much as kind of cultural materialism. But that's all I have to say by way of response, and I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts are. Thanks again, Owen.
Thank you. Can I, well, I'll open the floor to people to ask questions, but maybe I can ask what came to my head as I was reading it as well. I mean, I really liked the approach, and I think the question that came to me was around sort of what you just said in your reply there, Marie, around making sure that culture and ideas are considered in a material way. And it's the kind of constant challenge, I guess, for sort of Marxist approaches about how do you actually deal with ideas without just reducing them to something that emerges from the real material world. But then I wondered whether there is still a dualist, like, do we completely collapse that dualism between material and ideas? Or is that is it unhelpful even to start thinking about it in that way? And if we do try to move away from that dualist way of like there's the material and the ideas, then in what way are we still related to the material? I mean, basically, can we really escape the dualism of the material and the ideational, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Because at the end of the paper, you say, having said that ideas themselves are material and have material properties, which they do, obviously, because people think them and say them and act on them and so on. Then, but at the very end, you say the key thing is that we want to understand the culture in relation to the material, practical world of their use. So I guess I'm wondering whether that binary distinction is being blurred or collapsed, or collapsed but actually brought back in at the end, because we do need it eventually to be Marxists, otherwise we're not. So I guess that was sort of the thought that came to me, and that's probably revealing my ignorance rather than a meaningful question, but that's basically what I was thinking. I can see Ian's got a question as well. So Ian?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, when it came out, I think I posted on Twitter about how much I liked it, especially like the method. So in that sense, I'm similar to Owen in terms of it's almost more a case of some of the wider themes that the paper speaks to, because it's such a useful, almost shorthand for how we can think about using Williams in a Williamson way. And one thing that really struck me recently was in the new issue of historical materialism, there's a whole special issue about, basically how we look at capitalism historically. I mean, some of this debate is going on in international relations, sometimes elsewhere. But in the response by the two authors, like Sam Nafo and Benno Teschke, to some of the criticisms, they start talking about how can we think about the role of agency in capitalist history. And they refer to E.P. Thompson, and they actually criticized Thompson for his invocation of the word determinism. So they say that Thompson at some point actually folds back into a structuralist understanding of change. And I was there thinking, I can understand why you're saying that, but Thompson in the poverty theory especially is absolutely adamant he's taking that from Williams. And Williams is the definition of determinism. But I was then also thinking to myself, then how would I even convey this, even if I was there in a conference panel or something? It'd probably take me a good few minutes just to try to explain this word determinism and how it's been in effect used and misused compared to how Williams would understand it. So I guess I'm curious to know a bit more about some of the challenges I guess you've faced in terms of how you've tried to convey the importance of Williams's work without people misinterpreting him, and how you've tried to respond to that, and what kind of, if you have any strategies that you use. Because I know Owen and I have certainly talked about this before, where we've been in panels where people use Stuart Hall's work and we immediately are putting our hands up to say he actually didn't say that, or something like this. And then inevitably it comes a bit more like this is more of a comment than a question. And that is never good. So you're just curious to know about this wider insertion of Williams into those debates that you're part of, and how it's received and how you try to respond to what I guess is sometimes quite likely misinterpretations or misapprehensions of his work.
Thank you. Clemence, do you want to?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this. I have a comment and a question. My comment is just that I recently discovered Marxism and literature when working on the change of meaning of the different uses of the rainbow flag, especially recently in the UK, to sort of signify praise for the NHS. And so I was just thinking that the sort of the approach that you're talking about can also be used not just for keywords, but for key signs or key more generally. So this is, I think, at least, or perhaps you would add a word of caution on how to tackle these differently, these different signs that I would love to hear about that. But the other thing, my question is, it speaks really to, I think, what David was saying. Basically, how seriously should we take words then? We should definitely take them seriously, but then there is also a sort of danger, I think, and it's both scientific and political, to sort of over invest to overstate their importance, and I see that in a sort of political tendency as well that we have on the left, when we call out people for using the wrong words or things like that. So I was wondering also about that, whether there isn't, where do you stop in order to remain a Marxist, basically, in your taking seriously of words. I hope this was sort of clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Should I respond, David?
Please, yeah, please.
Okay, so I'll try to remember what I was thinking as I listened to three very interesting comments and questions. So thank you, everybody. David, I think you're right to raise that issue of, whether it's actually possible to collapse this duality, or desirable in any sense. After all, if everything is material, then what is ideal? Or if everything is ideal, then what is material? And I think, okay, so often that distinction between the material and the ideal is transposed onto a distinction between economy and culture. And I think they're useful as analytical categories, but I think both culture and economy are sets of practices that are themselves intrinsically ideal and material in that cultural materialist sense that Williams describes, which is meaningful activities organized or animated by some sort of organizing logic or a series of conflicting organizing logics that nonetheless overall have a particular character that makes them more economic, so to do with production, exchange, distribution, or more cultural, to do with values, beliefs, traditions, and so on. So I don't think it is useful to try to collapse the distinction completely, and I think it's especially unhelpful, which I think Nancy Fraser slips into this a bit, and Judith Butler picks up on it back in that, redistribution recognition debate in the 90s. So I think it's particularly unhelpful where that is overlaid onto a kind of a false culture economy distinction, but nonetheless they are valuable analytical distinctions to maintain, I think, in the way I've described. I think for Williams, it all comes back to this. In other work I've written about how I think Williams replaces the materialist premise of Marxism with a cultural materialist premise. So this idea that what drives human history is this need to satisfy, or this requirement to satisfy basic human needs through, production, the production of tools and machinery, and this gives rise to an economic structure and so on. He replaces that, I think, with a cultural materialist premise, which supplements the materialist premise with the idea of practical consciousness. And he relies on that quote from Marx, that that when the best of architects, the worst of architects, and like the best of bees, constructs the edifice in his mind before he begins work. So analytically, we shouldn't collapse the duality, but I think when you look at practical activities that people engage in, it's always practical and material and animated by some kind of form of consciousness that Williams refers to as practical consciousness. So I have gone back and forth over that, and I think it is discussed in various ways in Marxism literature. David, I'm not sure if I answered it satisfactorily for you or for me, but that's where my thinking heads with it.
No, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks. Ian, yeah, I think there's always a myth of kind of a danger of the myth of the great figure and what people think that person has said, replacing any kind of engagement, direct engagement with reading their work. And I'm definitely guilty of that, you know, in relation to other people who I haven't had the time to read in depth. And I think people say, oh yeah, you know, he said this type of thing. And then it kind of takes on a life of its own, this kind of later interpretation of the concept. But I think, and like Clemence has said, Marxism literature is really such an important book in understanding, for me, it's the most important book in understanding what Williams has to say. And I'm always amazed at how many people write about keywords and don't read that book, because I think, and in it, he has a chapter on determination. It's chapter 2 in part 2. And it's just so clear and so helpful, and he sets out exactly what he means by it. So at a very practical level, I would sort of direct people to that. And I tend to engage with where I can, like with what you know, what Joe Wolfe says about Marx, you know, when everybody criticized, well, did Marx really mean this or did he not mean this in the preface to critique political economy? And he said, well, you know, since Marx wrote it, we should assume that he meant it. So I kind of take that approach and quite literally go back to the text. But you don't need me to be telling you that, Ian, because I know you do that. So I don't think that's really I don't know if I'm really answering exactly what you asked about the content of what Williams means by determinism or determination. I think you're on mute, Ian.
Sorry. No, I think I suppose it's related to that. So that's really helpful in terms of which text within his wider work you would rely on, if that's the right word, to try and help clarify certain things that maybe have gone awry. But I suppose one issue I find, and again, this is something I always find when I'm trying to say something about Stuart Hall's work, is like the method by which they even just write their sentences. The method by which they think through, you can almost see them thinking as they're writing, rather than present something as a final, you know, here's my philosopher's stone, you know, I found it and everyone should now worship this. And that very provisionality is, first of all, what I find so useful about people like Williams and Hall, but also what then makes it so easy for them to be read in different ways. Yeah. And it's almost like, you know, but then I was really struck by how you started this whole talk by saying it just kept nagging me that I had to do it, while other more important things. And so I'm really, really glad you did anyway. So that's one of the reasons why I was curious about it, is because obviously something must have just kept biting at you to feel, no, this just has to be put down somewhere. And I've even thought recently, I think I might have to do the same for Hall somewhere in my own work. Because I think, you know, what you've done is really quite helpful and inspiring in that respect.
Oh, thanks very much, Ian. And I think you're totally right. I often find that the way Raymond Williams writes and the way you're describing how Stuart Hall writes, when I sit down and read a chapter of 2 Williams, I start thinking differently afterwards. But maybe I'm very attentive to how words shape thought, because I find there's such precision and care taken in how he writes, and how the words, very old-fashioned language sometimes, of describing connections, you know, connections spelt with the X, C-O-N-N-E-X-I-N, you know, there's just a kind of switch into a different kind of very relational way of thinking that I think is just so embedded in his writing. And I think, you know, it's kind of like in the preface of the making of the English Working Class by Thompson, who you're referring to as well. There's such simple language in there, but it captures this worldview that I think is at the core of kind of cultural materialism. And I think people properly sit themselves into that and read it. They see it. It's harder then to be diverted and saying, oh no, I think that, you know, Williams definitely meant this or all meant that. That's the kind of romanticism of language in me as well. But Clemence, yeah, thanks for I think it's an important point that we don't overstate the importance of words. And I think you're quite right. I think there's a huge lack of generosity on the left now in this willingness to call people out, and that was quite at odds with Williams's approach, which was very much about education. Fundamentally, from the very beginning, I mean, he started off like the other three in adult education and saw it as a means of, you know, saw culture in the sense as a way of doing politics by other means. And there was a much deeper understanding that people's limited language was very much connected to their social position. And sometimes that's to a privileged social position and sometimes it's not. But the idea that you would go straight to this kind of calling out, aggressive, anti-solidaristic kind of mode, I think it's just not there in that earlier Williams stuff. There's just a much more expansive generosity of spirit in how concepts are introduced and what people are expected to know and not know, and how people are shaped ideologically but not dupes of that culture, still with the capacity to be educated, an educated democratic citizenry, or, you know, people who are, you know, who can act back on the circumstances that also shape them. And I don't see so much that in some areas of the left, and it does bother me. And I've been thinking a lot about the language of privilege and this idea, check your privilege. But for me, I think it's more useful to talk about entitlement. And I think, again, this is sort of a keyword shift. Privilege is extremely important, but there's a sense in which some privileges are divested to people by their social circumstances, the social situation that they find themselves, the families they were born into. When you act on that privilege in a particular way, then you're talking about entitlement. And I'm much rather, you know, if you're going to call people out, I think doing it on the grounds of entitlement rather than privilege in that very unthinking sense in which it's used now is a much more helpful way. Do I think this means putting words above everything else? No, I kind of think it means putting words in their place and recognizing their power, but their power is only ever tied to the social circumstances in which they're used, the power of the actors and how they're situated in relation to one another. So yeah, and I don't have a particular view on how a cultural materialist approach could be used to analyze signs like flags and so on. But if you do proceed down that line, I'd love to chat to you about it or see where that thinking takes you.
Great, thank you. We've got one more in the chat, if that's okay. Rosie, do you want to try your connection, or shall I read it out for you? I'll take silence as meaning you want me to read it out. Okay, so Rosie says, great paper, both the article and your presentations are very rich. Will you be subjecting the concept of elites to a keywords analysis in your forthcoming book? And if so, have you identified key moments of change and rupture with respect to the uses of the word and the material contexts for its deployment? If so, I'd love to hear more. Thanks, Rosie. Do you want to?
Yeah, yes, I have. And so the word elite is very interesting. It's part of the reason why I've been thinking about privilege and entitlement and different iterations of that meaning. But the word elite is originally a French word meaning elect. And elect had that dual meaning of elected, so people who were legitimately chosen and voted into positions of power, but also the selected in the sort of Weberian sense, you know, that the elect, the chosen ones who actually weren't there through merit or desert. So the very concept of elite in its origins ties together these dual ideas of the best shall rise to the top and they should be there, and the idea that they're illegitimately in that place due to other privileges and factors in their lives. The word elite, we only started, it emerged into the social sciences within a discourse that was, and within a social science that was deliberately anti-Marxist. It was used by theorists to describe an alternative view of society that was fundamentally opposed to a Marxist view of a ruling class and everybody else. It was about this rotation of elites and this kind of idea. It embodies ideas of meritocracy and equality of opportunity, that basically anybody can become an elite, which is obviously as ideological then as it is now. And very interestingly, it only really started to be used more widely in the early 20th century. When people talk about the Populist Party in the United States as being the first left anti-elitist movement, I've gone through all their texts and pamphlets and manifestos and anything I can find it, and they never ever use the word elite ever. So it didn't mean then what it means now. So again, I'm starting to kind of hone in on the fact that there was a significant shift taking place, and I think there are competing conceptions of elites. There are different anti-elitist attitudes that settle on competing attitudes to privilege, and they are roughly but not completely aligned with left and right. And I'm trying to trace those historically up to today, where we have a point where left and right both purport to be anti-elitist, but in doing so as part of very, very different political projects with very, very different attitudes to equality and privilege. So that's not a very clear overview because I wasn't expected to talk about it, but that's where I'm going with it. So yeah, a keywords analysis is less central than it was to my identity book, but it's definitely foundational. But I kind of move on a lot more into the politics of elites and anti-elitism after that. Hope that answers it, Rosie, and thanks for your kind words as always.
Thanks. Can I, because it's actually, when you're thinking about applying it and using the approach, and especially in like contemporary discussions, you mentioned in the paper about like the digitalization of everything. It means that it's so much easier to get hold of the text, but that also means that text itself is so much more, proliferates so much more. So I wonder whether, like, what effect that's going to, like, will there still be keywords when we're kind of surrounded by such a huge increase in volume of words?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
they change. I guess I was thinking changes quicker as well. Perhaps the keyword, like the debates that happen, seem to go quicker as well because there's so much text that we're surrounded by. So I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I think it's the Webster online dictionary. There's some online dictionary anyway. When you just put in a word, it's mapped its use. So like you'll see it peaks in 1950s or it peaks in 2011 or whatever. But I also, there was an article written by Ben Highmore that came out around the same time as my article, and it's called Keywording, and it's about the practice of keywords, and he refers to my article in it. And he said a problem he has is when you raised the question of scope, like where do you stop? Like, you know, how do you know when to stop the search, or like what are the limits of that? It's potentially endless, and that's, you know, enhanced or aggravated by the digitalization of everything. But I think you're trying to find the point of emergence of a new meaning, and that is relatively easily done, or the point of change. And then you focus your efforts on the texts that were written around that time and since then. So again, it's always in relation to the context of its use. So you're not just endlessly trawling words, just like little markings on a page. You know, in a way, it's like, it feels like a kind of an academic detective game. You're, you know, and I remember when, you have these kind of eureka moments where you think, oh, everybody is talking about, you know, how, for example, Bourdieu wrote about elites, or about how W. Du Bois wrote about identity. And then when you go back and because of digitalization, you search all his works and you find he never mentioned identity, never. So then you understand that identity did not mean then what it means now. And then you narrow your search again. And then the Oxford English Dictionary is brilliant on this as well. And that's what Raymond Williams used as a resource. And that's what, you know, I don't know how many hundreds of researchers tracing when words changed, you know, the historical dictionary. But that's a really good source as well to use. And sometimes it doesn't pick up on the change that you've detected. And often the change that you've detected is related to your world of research. It's related to stuff you've read about. So you probably have a bit of a hunch, but then you've got to test and check that hunch loads and go to the text. And then because you're looking at the connection between the context and that change of meaning, it does actually narrow the scope in a way that makes it manageable and I think meaningful, but maybe I'll eat my words.
Great, thank you. Any final questions from the people here? Otherwise, I want to go back to Owen for some final comments if you've got any.
I mean, not essentially in terms of the discussion just now. I mean, I think there were some quite useful points. Certainly, the symbolism, which I think Clement discussed, which is over the NHS and the fact that semiotics around that. I mean, just that just interested me. That sort of applies or places itself within the wider context of that wider tradition of Hoggart, Hall, Williams, so I think Williams shouldn't just be used, on his own. I think it's a paradigm of a wider tradition, and I suppose to go back to some of the points which have already been made. I suppose the wider way that these various people within culture, so these various sort of figureheads think, and how they identified their arguments through understanding things like articulation. At time you have this, as Marie said, this aorist appearance. It's almost spontaneous in some of the some of the work which has been developed, and I think that's it's that tapping into that tradition which is important. That's why it always amuses me when people always use that quote from Stuart Hall about thinking in a Gramscian way, and they always just plonk it in, say, think in a Gramscian way. But I think there's someone just asking a question actually at the end, so I'll just finish off quickly. I think that's in itself is an interesting comment, because it's this tradition is generally something which is interlinked around understanding how cultures and signs and linguistical formulations reach themselves through this open form, if you like, of cultural materialism, which isn't necessarily structured across certain forms. They're very much articulated and de-articulated on an open terrain. And I just think it's almost that imagination, almost going back, I think also reminiscent of something Ian said a long time ago when he talked about method, Marx's method, and he talked about it in terms of poetry and literature, and a far more sort of a humanities-based approach, and this sort of imaginatory approach, which obviously got a lot of people very excited, sort of rigid scientists very excited over this. And I think it's that more than anything, it's that is really meant by the sort of the method of thinking and the method of understanding things, of thinking in that particular imaginative way. I hope I haven't waffled on too much here. I think there's a question, David, from Marco.
Oh yeah, okay. Marco, do you want, and then we'll come back to you, Marie, for an answer and a final comments, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Thank you, Marie, for the very interesting presentation. I'll briefly introduce myself. I teach at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy, in the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences. And we're starting actually a keywords research group with a group of doctoral students and graduate students. And some of them are actually attending the seminar right now. And we just met once. And then we found your article and this event, so we thought of attending the seminar to see precisely how we can work together, keywords as method. And in my understanding, from your article and your presentation, you're underscoring the importance of going deep, also diachronically working around a relatively homogeneous cluster of keywords, or at least on a group of keywords at a time, or that seems to me the type of work you're doing. And when I was thinking about the Williams book, he uses words that are in different semantic fields, like culture, industry, class, and then he tries to connect them. And of course, in a research group, you get all these heterogeneity of research interests. So the question is how to balance the this kind of deep, kind of drilling approach that each one of us can have with a more diachronic approach, historically speaking. That is how to connect the dots. And so I was wondering whether you thought about that, what you think, for example, about the Grossberg book, which came out of this attempt to make a collaborative project. And when you look at the book, the entries are quite heterogeneous. You can tell also that perhaps people haven't worked really together. Some of them did, but others simply contributed to the book. So it's not easy, I think, to strike a balance between our personal research interests and then trying to connect them. We are starting with the dictionaries, and we want to do that in Italian as well, because we don't have access to the Oxford English Dictionary. We have access online, but we don't even know how updated it is. So we'll do that partly in English and partly in Italian. And in Florence, actually, we had the fortune that the kind of cradle of the language, the national language is there. So there are historical dictionaries we can consult. I could ask you more about your identity and capitalism project, which I'm also interested in, but I'll stop here for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Marie?
Thank you so much, Marco. I'm really glad that there's a few of you here to talk about this, and in light of your research group and your shared project. I suppose I would say the main thing is to be faithful to the method. I know exactly the book you're talking about, Grossberg, Bennett and Morris, I think it is. And I also had a major problem with it. I thought the introduction was lovely, and that was written by those three authors and really grasped the essence and the spirit of Williams' approach. But the individual entries, many of them were horrible. Like they just were very sort of irritatingly academic, in the sense that they just looked at the history of academic words and how they relate to each other, and kind of academic fights in the field, sort of academic infighting, which totally misses the point. So I think if everybody in your group is really faithful to the spirit of the original, that organically, you know, by drilling down, I don't know how you're managing it, but if everybody is choosing a word or a cluster of words to focus on, and if they really stay faithful to the method, that what will emerge is a picture of how that word functions in that cultural materialist sense, both diachronically and synchronically across, you know, in relation to other words, and then historically in relation to its own internal development of meaning. And then I think maybe if you sat back and then looked for the connections, there may not be any. You know, I wouldn't try to force connections that aren't there, but I think if everybody is truthful to the method, let's emerge what is there, uncovers what is there, and then maybe if you collectively you swapped your projects and had a look and see, you know, you might find that themes of privilege or themes of choice or other things that you didn't anticipate were coming up, or that people were identifying, you know, that in the 70s in an Italian context there was a shift to a particular understanding of statehood, or I don't know, I'm just totally talking off the top of my head, but that would emerge organically through the project. But I think the key thing is that everybody is faithful to the method, and it'll emerge from that, rather than sort of trying to identify something that may not be there. But I'm happy to talk to you about it, Marco, off, you know, another time we can email and have a chat. I'm happy to do that if that's of interest.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay. Do you want a final word, Marie?
No, just thank you very much, everybody. I'm really happy to have had this opportunity, and it's been really nice to get your insights, and thanks to everybody who came along, and to David and the CPERN crew for organising, and Owen for for all your reflections and the time you took as well. So appreciate it all. Thank you.
No, thanks to you. Thanks for speaking and giving us a lot to think about. And thanks to Owen for being the discussant. So our next workshop next month is Developments in Social Reproduction Theory, and the confirmed speaker is Kirsten Monroe. And also watch this space, because tomorrow we're going to release the call for papers for the next conference, so we can actually meet in person for once rather than only on Zoom, which I think people will be pleased about, hopefully, as long as we can still travel by then, or travel by then, depending on what our situation is currently. But the date is going to be 22nd to 23rd of July next year, and the venue is going to be at the University of Limerick, and Owen's going to host us for the weekend, so that will be nice. So watch the space. Please do consider submitting papers. We're trying to pitch it in a broad way, so hopefully people will find something in the call for papers that will attract them, and we hope to see people there as well. Otherwise, I think that's the end. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Marie and Owen. It's been great discussion, and see you all soon, hopefully.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you, Marie. What a great work.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I really want to kind of dig more into this, because I always